Hello, world. This is episode 17 of the Know Your Place podcast. On this week's episode, I'm going to be talking about coastline development and what it looks like in Wisconsin on Lake Michigan and on the Atlantic Ocean in North Carolina, South Carolina, and the Savannah area of Georgia because I'm familiar with these places. Stay tuned. Charles Altendorf here, and you're listening to episode 17 of the Know Your Place podcast. So, on this week's episode, I wanted to talk about an interesting geographic phenomenon that, once again, I don't think gets talked about very much, and that is the geography around coastal development. Now, I guess it does get talked about some, but people generally talk about it in terms of flooding, which, don't get me wrong, is very important, and other sorts of issues revolving around the beach. But I wanted to talk about sort of different development patterns that I've observed along shorelines. And I'm going to talk about the areas I know about. And that will be the North Carolina, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia areas, and the Wisconsin, Lake Michigan coastal areas, because these are places I've lived. So, anyway, let's dive right in here. So, when we talk about shoreline development, often we think of shorelines as very uniform and gentle curves, because that's what they look like on maps when they're zoomed out. But generally speaking, they're very jagged, and there's constant spots where parts of the shore stick out and stuff is developed on them, and we don't really think about that. We kind of block that from our minds. And I think really interesting stuff develops in those places. So, the first, and on other weeks' episodes, sometimes when I've compared and contrasted places, they haven't been sort of the overarching difference. I mean, I think I've done a reasonably good job of not talking about stuff that's all exactly the same, but this week's episode in particular, I think you'll notice a very drastic difference between the two areas I'm describing. So, in Wisconsin, there are sort of three major cities that are quasi on Lake Michigan. Now, there's other ones too. Wisconsin has a lot of harbor towns, but and actually, one of the ones I'm going to talk about is technically on Green Bay, which feeds into Lake Michigan. So, anyway, so everybody's probably heard of Milwaukee and Green Bay, and I think a decent number of other people have heard of Sheboygan. Now, all these cities, what I think really stands out about the way they developed is they all sort of developed along rivers that feed into Lake Michigan is where their downtowns are, but their downtowns are very close to the edge of the water, like less than a mile to the edge of the water. You're not going very far to get there, and that looks very different when we contrast it to the areas I know well in the coastal Atlantic region I was talking about. For example, in North Carolina, there's Wilmington, North Carolina, and it is buffered from Lake Michigan, from the Atlantic Ocean, by places like Wrightsville Beach and Carolina Beach. And, basically, anywhere in Wrightsville, you have to go get in a car and drive 10 or 15 minutes, sometimes 30, to get to the beach. You're still not in the beach, even though we think of it is a harbor town. An even starker example is Savannah, Georgia, where you basically drive all the way out to Tybee Island, which is a 30-minute drive from downtown Savannah, and people think of Savannah as a harbor town. Now, it is a harbor town, kind of, but it's not really one, right? Like, when we think of a harbor town, we think, oh, you depart for the water from there. And you kind of don't. You kind of don't in Savannah. So, um, yeah. So, and then the other another example would be Charleston, South Carolina. A lot of people don't realize this, but the edge of Battery Park, or the edge of Charleston proper, is still a few miles inland. The outer islands like Morris Island and Sullivan Island, they're the ones that actually touch the ocean. So you still have like a 5 or 10 minute boat ride from the edge of Charleston out into the Atlantic Ocean. And again, we think of Charleston as one of the old harbor towns, and it's a harbor town, right? And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to pretend like it's not, but it's different than what, like I said, in Wisconsin, where we're up against the water. And of course, that could probably be chalked up to the fact that weather is probably more violent off of the Atlantic Ocean than it is off of Lake Michigan. All of these places I think have been hit by hurricanes at some point that we're talking about on the Atlantic Ocean, whereas, storms do happen in Milwaukee and Sheboygan and Green Bay, but I'm sure nothing on the level of hurricanes. So, anyway, so the other thing I wanted to talk about is sort of the difference in development styles. So, what's really weird, though, isn't just that these places along the Atlantic Ocean are set further in. It's that once you get out to these barrier islands, there's not much public land. You see, there are access points to the beach, and there are public beaches, but in Wisconsin, you have a lot of spots near where I'm talking about, with Green Bay being a slight exception. There's not as much public beach land right up in Green Bay as there is in Sheboygan and Milwaukee, but you have miles of uninterrupted shoreline that is basically just public access. There's not really any types of restrictions on what you can and can't do. Whereas in lots of spots that we're talking about with North Carolina, South Carolina, and the greater Savannah area, it's private beach. You can't go there. You can only go there if you're staying at that hotel there, or the person that owns it lets you, or, at the end of the day, it's not public property. So, now we'll sort of talk about the way some of these places are laid out. So, Milwaukee, what I really think is interesting, in downtown Milwaukee, and it's also kind of true of downtown Sheboygan now, and not quite as much true with Green Bay, but still to some extent, is that what they have done is they've taken some of their old harbor spaces, like coal docks and things, and turned them into parks, and they create these really weird jettisons out into the water. So, like, there's a giant bridge you go over to go over the harbor of Milwaukee on Interstate 794 called the Hone Bridge. And as you drive over and you're coming from the south, and you look over to the right out into Lake Michigan, there's this park that just jets out there. And it comes up, it's a very narrow strip of land that jets out there and makes a little peninsula, and they've named it after baseball legend Hank Aaron, and it's now a national park, which is so weird because it's like this little tiny space and it's out in the water. And I think it's really cool because, that means the average person like you and me can go out there and just experience themselves being surrounded by water and get encapsulated in the waves and all kinds of other things. And another place, this isn't as major of a city, but my parents' hometown of Port Washington. Now, it's at your own risk, mind you, but they have a their barrier wall to protect the harbor actually goes out to the lighthouse, and it's like a mile-long walk out into Lake Michigan, and when you get to the end of it, you just feel like you're engulfed in the lake. It's really cool. I would suggest, though, not going there when it's icy at all and being very careful. Because, nobody wants to come bail you out if you fall in. So, and that's really cool because this is all public space we're talking about. And then in Sheboygan, what they did, which I thought was pretty cool, is they took their old coal dock, because they no longer have a coal-powered a coal-powered power plant is they took their old coal dock and a hotel developer turned it into an indoor water park. It's called the Blue Harbor Resort. And so, because in Wisconsin, although it's great and it's on the lake on the eastern shore there, and there's all kinds of, it's really cool. I mean, you can really only enjoy the beach part of it, 2 or 3 months out of the year because it's so cold. Well, this sort of turns that on its head, because you can then enjoy a lot of the water stuff inside while still being next to the lake and enjoying the views of the lake. And it's become a whole development project. It doesn't just have a hotel. There's lots of little neat restaurants opening up branches there, and it's very cool. And there's coffee shops and condos and everything. And I imagine one day it will be, well, it already is a very happening location. And then so that's what's cool there. Now, when we talk about development in these places in the Atlantic region, I actually found myself very somewhat disappointed in the level of development. Now, don't get me wrong, Myrtle Beach is the exception here in South Carolina. There's development right along the water, and there are a decent number of public spaces and interesting things. But when you talk about areas like Atlantic Beach and Tybee Island, at least I've been to those places, you feel like once you've been to one of these beach towns, you've been to all of these beach towns. And I'm not saying that in a flattering way. It's like you got people with their little beachfront houses, and then if they're real aggressive, some of these towns, they build condos, like in Atlantic City, Maryland. It's all condos, all 20-story condos, all along the front. Luckily, Ocean City, Maryland, and Virginia Beach were kind of wiser by building boardwalks at least, so at least there's some public space. But, it doesn't, there's not a lot of attractions. There's some commercial development, but generally speaking, I'm assuming if you stay at Tybee Island or Wrightsville, you're spending the majority of your time back in Wilmington or Savannah to enjoy the cool things. And I always thought the whole point of going to somewhere like Tybee Island or Wrightsville Beach was to go and enjoy the ocean. Then why would you want to go back inland every day just to enjoy the ocean? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So yeah, that's what I think about that. And then other things that are interesting about coastal developments is what do you do to sort of, my biggest question is, what do you do to keep the land in the current state? Because the land is kind of changing, right? It's always kind of changing. And I don't know what you do to preserve those sort of areas. Because I remember when I was a kid and I was in school in North Carolina, they were talking about how people were bringing in sand to keep their beach built up. So they would bring it in from somewhere else and dump it. And people said that was very ecologically unstable. And I'm assuming it probably was. I mean, it sounds crazy to bring in water. It seems very unnatural to come in and bring in sand to keep building up this area. But these people, I mean, if it's their private property, they've invested a lot of money in these places. We're talking some of these places range into millions of dollars, these investments. So they can't just let it erode away, can they? Or should they be forced to let it erode away? And if they do, then what kind of compensation is the government going to give them for taking that risk? I don't know. Obviously, you have events like Hurricane Sandy that happened up in New Jersey, and that really affected a lot of areas there. But everybody always seems determined to build back in these communities. I think it's part of the, I don't know if it's the American foolishness or spirit, but we don't like to be told we can't live somewhere that we're used to living. We fight, we build, we're gonna conquer Mother Nature, if you will. So I don't know what you do about that erosion. In the case of even Wisconsin, my parents' hometown, for a while they've been having a problem of big waves coming in and hitting the bluff, because in my parents' hometown, very few people actually live right on the level of the lake. A lot of people generally live in the right off of it, up on the hills above it. And the downside of that, though, is that there's lots of fear that the hills that they're living on, that the waves are crashing into and eventually cutting it down. And I mean, granted, this has been over a long period of time, but should they be doing something to, sturdy up the hills? Once again, to protect these people's investment, or a very nice park there called Upper Lake Park exists up there, and, do they want to make sure that that park never falls down to the ground below it? I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that question. Maybe somebody in the comments section could tell me what should be done, if it's just inevitably part of Mother Nature, or if, you should be allowed to protect your investment because it's your investment by whatever means necessary. So the last thing I wanted to sort of talk about in the regards to shoreline development is another sort of contrast to these two areas, and that is riverfront development. Now, riverfront development is a lot more unstable, in my opinion, than the Atlantic Ocean or Lake Michigan development, because rivers flood. Rivers constantly change which way they go. They can flow opposite directions sometimes. They can create oxbow lakes like the Mississippi River. And, but people do desire the property. Like, I see all the time people invest in houses that are like almost $1 million on the Ohio River. And you wonder, is that a good investment? Is this water going to change in 10 or 15 years? Is it going to come get you and flood out your investment? I don't know. I mean, I would like to think that, you should probably, if you're going to do that, build on a little bit higher ground. But it seems like some people don't understand that concept. I think you're better off building on a lake or even the Atlantic Ocean, despite the risks that you would have building along the Atlantic Ocean. Because river development, to me, is very unstable. Although downtown Milwaukee has been built over top of the Milwaukee River now for a couple hundred years. But, I think they've done a lot to sort of force the river to stay put. Which brings in a whole nother slew of questions about what's ecologically viable. Anyway, so let me know in the comments section what you think of interesting shoreline developments. Do you think the shoreline should be private or public property? Do you think it's wise to invest in riverfront development? Or do you think it's even wise to invest in lakefront development? Will everything inevitably flood at some point? I don't know. Stay tuned. Thanks, y'all. Check out the Know Your Place podcast on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/knowyourplacepodcast, all one word, or on Facebook at facebook.com/knowyourplacepodcast, all one word. And we will be coming soon to YouTube and iTunes, and maybe another social media platform near you. Special thanks to my wife, Sarah, and Jay Graff for the riff.